Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to this next episode of our sermon preparation for the upcoming Sunday, the 19th of February 2023. And this coming Sunday is the last Sunday of ordinary time for a while before we head into Lent. Te rātapu tuawhitu o te wā no iho, the seventh Sunday in ordinary time. And in it we're continuing on with the Sermon on the Mount. And as has been a little bit of the pattern we're trying to build up, we'll have a think first of all about how we look at the passage in its original setting, have a think about how that might then play out for us today, and particularly in the context that we find ourselves in within tikanga Māori. This passage has two aspects to it. One of them is about revenge, and then more positively it's about having love for enemies. And the passage about revenge picks up on a traditional saying, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that goes back into the Old Testament, but which was never really intended as a way of saying this is what you must do to somebody who harms you. Instead, it was a limit on the amount of harm that you could do in response to somebody. Nevertheless, here, Jesus picks up on this and takes it a whole step further, as he's done before with all of this. In his function here as the new and better Moses, he's gone up the mountain to give God's law, the family rules in a way, the way in which God's people are expected to behave. And he says that from now on, if there was ever any doubt about this, we need to take a step further and not just limit how much harm we do in response to evil actions. We're going to find a way to do good. So if somebody slaps you on the cheek, an insulting gesture, then let them do it again to you on the other side. If somebody takes your shirt away from you, then let them have more. And this last one reflects an aspect of Roman law that a soldier could compel you to travel 1 mile. They had mile markers all over the empire. And Jesus says, well, instead of limiting it to just what the law requires you to do, which, by the way, was a horrible thing anyway, this is the occupying army taking you, forcing you to help them in their occupation of your land. The imperial forces here of colonization, we might say, you're going to help them go even further. Now, we'll come back to why this is so difficult in a moment, but I just want you to realize an awful lot of ink has been spilt by people trying to say, well, Jesus didn't really mean this, so that, you know, we should, in fact, act to protect ourselves and so on and so forth. There's just nothing in this which gives us an openness to that as a way of engaging with it. So just for the moment, just hold on to the awkwardness of that, and then have a think here around what Jesus says about our enemies themselves and our attitude towards them. He says, you may have heard the law, you've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And that last bit, hate your enemy, is not found in the law. Instead, it's just love your neighbor. He says, love your enemies. And this is a very significant thing to say. And I think we can only truly make sense of it as Christians in the context of Jesus' own life and ministry. This is where Jesus tries to frame this in terms of our relationship with him. If you do this, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. And what Jesus says is that our Father in heaven is very generous to us, to all of his children. And the implication is that we are not deserving of this. And so it's kind of odd that God would behave this way towards us when we don't deserve it. And in fact, we can pick up in other parts of the Bible that the way in which we behave, the fact that we don't meet God's standards, does by right make us God's enemies. But God chooses to behave towards us in a very different way, to act very generously towards us. And if we're going to be his children, if we're part of his family, the way to follow the family rules, we're the children, not the father of the household. The way to follow the family rules is to echo that generosity given out to others. So Jesus says, you know, if you only love people who love you, you're merely being kind of normal. Like that's the minimum for being a civilized human being. Only a psychopath would behave worse than that. But we're called to a higher standard. We're supposed to be what the image of God was meant to look like. To be children of God here is to say that we are his uri. We're meant to let other people see what he is like by the way that we behave. And if we behave only at the sort of very low bar of just not being psychopaths, that's not really what Jesus is looking for. He's looking for us to stand out, to show people what the image of God is really like. People will look at us and say, well, now I've met the children, I'd love to meet the Father. And so he's saying here that this family behavior has a mission impulse to it, because it calls us beyond ourselves to paint a picture of something more. In fact, he finishes up by saying, you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And you might recall before, Jesus was saying you need to be more righteous than the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law. And here Jesus lands this completely. He says, you must be perfect. You must be blameless. These are words which have a great deal of resonance in the Old Testament. And Jesus isn't placing before us here an impossible burden. We talked last week about the way that Jesus' sacrifice, his death on the cross is the framing of this Sermon on the Mount, and gives us a way back to God, a welcome at the table. But at the same time, there is a call here to a very high standard, not just of behavior, but of attitude in our hearts towards those who harm us. And so a hallmark of Jesus' family, of the children of God the Father, is that we are going to act in this way towards people who are undeserving and who are our enemies. And Jesus' motivation for this is that God has acted that way as our Father towards us, who are undeserving and who by our actions had placed ourselves in the position where God could treat us as his enemies if he chose. And of course, the point here is that God has chosen to treat us very differently, very generously, in a way that opens up the door to us. And so we should do the same when people behave the same way towards us. And there are a number of parables which pick up on this, most of all the unforgiving servant towards the end of Matthew's gospel, which picks up on this whole thing around the relationship between the generosity God has shown to us and the generosity we must in turn pass on to others. Now, I imagine that many of you, when you encountered that instruction of Jesus there around the soldier who compels you to go 1 mile, and you go to, Jesus says, go 2 with that soldier, you might well start to think here around, in our own setting as Maori, the issue might well be, how do we behave towards those who are complicit with, or were complicit with, or are the descendants of those who were complicit in the many evils of colonization and imperial domination of Aotearoa. And I think there is a massive challenge here from Jesus to think about how we can be generous. Jesus, by the way, never lets people off the hook. So it's not as if Jesus is saying the evil that was done is to be ignored. In fact, most of all, his death on the cross shows us how seriously God takes evil. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, takes it so seriously that he goes to the cross to both pay the price that is incurred by evil and to defeat the power of evil in the world. And we're given that hope of when he returns, that he will come as the judge, not just as the savior, but as the judge of all that is. He will say that was wrong and will never be in the earth again. And this was right and will be there. So please don't take this as meaning that God somehow overlooks evil or does not consider it worthy of his attention. Instead, we have to place this within the context of Jesus' wider life and teaching. And in fact, the fact that he's saying here what we do matters. All of this tells us that behavior of evil colonial forces, of imperial forces, these things are not ignored by God. But for the moment, Jesus wants us to focus on our own reaction to that. Do we see ourselves, Jesus is really asking us, as the judge of all the earth? In other words, where do we fit into this picture? Are we God's children here, or are we God's judge? And I think our instinct often is to be God's judge, and we're confronted with the fact that we ourselves have been acquitted when we don't deserve to be. And so Jesus is calling on us, hey, leave that to me. I'm going to deal with it. For the moment, our challenge is to think about ourselves and our own reaction. Now, that does not mean that we abandon the teaching of Jesus. We don't hold it out to society. We still do. That's part of our calling. But part of our calling is also a personal response. And that personal response has to be one where the hallmark is generosity rather than the hallmark of our personal response being judgment around the issue of justice. So generosity is the hallmark of the Christian's individual behavior and response. Now, how you land that will depend on your context, but it may well be that, like me, you encounter people who are still complicit with acts of colonization. Our hallmark of our behavior towards them, without ever leaving aside God's teaching about justice, is to be generous to them, to show kindness because we ourselves have experienced that in Jesus Christ. When we do this, we need to frame our generosity within the story of Jesus to explain that it's because we've found this welcome from Jesus that we are able to then in turn be generous beyond ourselves. And I think that's a very difficult balance to strike. But my main worry is that in this particular text, our temptation is always to soften the challenge of Jesus' words. I've heard Americans, for example, and it's always easy to pick on the Americans, they're different from us. So let's think about them and how ridiculous it sounds when they say it. They'll say things like, Jesus didn't really mean, turn the other cheek to enemies. He really meant shoot them back. Now, I don't know how you get from this text to go and shoot them in the head. That's just not possible to come from turn the other cheek to shoot them. And yet people do. But how easy it would be for us to criticize them for not understanding Jesus' words without also giving attention to the way in which we don't want to fulfill what Jesus calls on us to do. That we might not want to turn the other cheek. We might want to, perhaps not with a gun, but with some other way we might want to pay them back. So if you think it sounds ridiculous to take Jesus' words here and say, really what Jesus meant was shoot them, well, I want to say, just be careful that you don't fall into a similar trap and think that Jesus here is saying to you, don't quite shoot them, but definitely give them a good slap. Jesus' words are confronting. The people who heard them were people living under imperial domination. When they heard Jesus say this, they were shocked and they were offended. And yet Jesus is trying to frame it here in terms of a family, in terms of a whānau. He's saying to these people, you have been brought in as God's children. Here is how God's family is supposed to behave. So if you've had an experience of the generosity of God, a good father who gives to his children even when they're undeserving, then the challenge in preaching this is to get that message across to the people who are listening that they have been offered this welcome into God's family, a generous welcome, and therefore they're to be marked by a generosity to other people, even others who are also undeserving. Kia ora tātou.